What do you think $150 buys you these days? A few overpriced coffees? Or a mediocre dinner? For me, that exact amount bought a ticket into the blood-soaked world of the military elite, where lies worth millions of dollars are wrapped in custom suits. I thought I was just saving a freezing mother from jail on a snowy night. Instead, I triggered a time bomb that would collapse an untouchable empire. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us now. Let's begin the story. My name is Haley Garza. I am 38 years old, and my soul was currently trapped somewhere between the glowing monitors of Vortex Data Solutions and the frozen asphalt of a suburban Denver Walmart. It was late, the kind of late where the cold seeps through your boots and freezes the marrow in your bones. A massive blizzard was tearing through Colorado, burying the city under a suffocating blanket of white. I was completely exhausted, running on barely 4 hours of sleep and far too much black coffee. As a senior fraud data analyst, my days were spent hunting ghosts in endless financial spreadsheets, tracking phantom transactions, and unearthing the darkest lies people told for money. But tonight, all I wanted was to buy some basic toothpaste, maybe a cheap bottle of wine, and find a brief moment of silence away from the numbers. I was pushing my metal cart toward the checkout lanes when I heard the sharp, authoritative bark of a security guard. It came from the open door of the loss prevention office near the front of the store. Against my better judgment, my boots stopped moving. Inside that small room, the overhead fluorescent lights buzzed with a sterile, unforgiving glare that made everything look sickly and pale. A large, red-faced guard stood with his arms crossed, looking down his nose with absolute, unadulterated disgust. Sitting on a cheap metal folding chair was a young woman. She was soaking wet, shivering uncontrollably beneath a paper-thin, oversized brown coat that offered zero protection against the storm outside. Clutched tightly to her chest was a toddler, maybe 2 years old. The little boy's face was flushed an unnatural red, radiating a feverish heat you could almost feel from the doorway. His breathing was shallow, rapid, and ragged. Spread across the gray metal desk in front of them was the grand loot, the undeniable evidence of her supposedly heinous crime: a single canister of baby formula, a small pack of generic diapers, a brightly colored bottle of children's fever medicine. I mentally calculated the retail cost of the items on the table. It was exactly $150. "I am calling the police," the guard sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You people think you can just walk in here and take whatever you want. Not on my watch." I looked at the young woman. Her name, I would later learn, was Chloe. She did not argue. She did not cry, beg for mercy, or offer pathetic excuses like the petty corporate thieves I occasionally watched on security footage during my investigations. Instead, her dark eyes held something much heavier and far more profound. It was a cold, hollow resignation, the exact look of a cornered animal that had finally run out of places to hide and was simply waiting for the final blow. She tightened her grip on her sick son, pressing her freezing cheek against his burning forehead. She was not afraid of the police because she was a common thief. She was afraid because she was absolutely terrified of being found. Something snapped inside my chest. Maybe it was the sheer exhaustion of my corporate life, or maybe it was just the crushing, mechanical indifference of the modern world staring me right in the face. I stepped into the office, my heavy boots leaving wet, muddy tracks on the clean linoleum floor. "There will not be any police," I said, keeping my voice flat, cold, and completely even. It was the exact same tone I used when dismantling a terrified embezzler in a glass boardroom. The guard blinked, clearly startled by the sudden intrusion. "Excuse me, who are you?" I reached into my heavy wool coat and pulled out my corporate credit card, tossing it onto the metal desk with a sharp clack. "I am her cousin. She forgot her wallet in my car, and I got held up in the electronics aisle looking for charging cables. Ring it up, all of it." $150. Right. The guard looked from me to the shiny plastic card, then down to Chloe. He desperately wanted to argue, to exert his tiny fraction of power over someone weaker, but the absolute authority in my voice left zero room for debate. He grumbled a string of curses under his breath, snatched the card, and aggressively processed the transaction. 5 minutes later, we were walking out through the automatic sliding doors and into the freezing storm. The wind howled across the empty parking lot, whipping sharp crystals of snow directly into our faces. I carried the plastic bag of supplies. Chloe carried the sick child. Once we were far enough from the bright neon lights of the store, I stopped and handed her the bag. Under the flickering, dying amber glow of a lonely street lamp, I finally got a good, analytical look at her, and my professional instincts, honed by a decade of analyzing human behavior and spotting anomalies, immediately screamed that something was terribly wrong. Her coat was a cheap, synthetic disaster bought from a thrift store, but the way she carried herself was entirely different. Her posture, the subtle way she articulated her physical movements, the elegant shape of her jawline, it all screamed of high society. This was a woman educated in elite private schools, not someone born to the harsh, unforgiving streets of Denver. Furthermore, she was not looking at me with the tearful gratitude you would expect from someone who was just saved from jail. Her eyes were constantly darting around the empty parking lot, scanning the deep shadows, checking the sightlines and the exit routes. These were not the reflexes of a desperate homeless mother simply trying to survive the winter cold. These were the hyper-vigilant, calculated movements of prey being actively hunted by a very dangerous predator. "You need to get him to a real doctor," I told her, my breath pluming like white smoke in the freezing air. "The fever medicine will only do so much. If you need a safe place to stay tonight, I have a warm apartment not far from here." Chloe flinched hard at the offer. Taking a quick, defensive half-step backward, she clutched the plastic bag of medicine so tightly her knuckles turned dead white. "No," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper against the howling wind, yet it was surprisingly cultured, smooth, and clear. "Thank you. You have done more than enough. Please, just forget you ever saw us." She did not wait for a reply or offer another backward glance. She turned sharply and hurried across the icy asphalt, heading toward the darkest, most isolated corner of the massive lot. A battered, rusted sedan sat hidden deep in the shadows, far away from any security cameras. She strapped the crying child into the back seat, climbed behind the wheel, and started the engine. The headlights did not even turn on as the vehicle slid silently out of the lot and vanished completely into the blinding white snow. I stood alone in the freezing cold, totally unaware that my simple act of paying $150 had just triggered a catastrophic chain of events. 72 hours passed before the real world violently collided with my quiet, mundane life. It was a Tuesday evening. I was sitting alone in my cramped second-floor apartment, staring blankly at a lukewarm bowl of canned soup, when the floorboards beneath my feet literally vibrated from the deep, bass-heavy rumble of a high-powered engine outside. I walked to the window and pushed aside the cheap, broken plastic blinds. Idling directly beneath my rusted fire escape was a massive, military-grade black sport utility vehicle. It was heavily armored, the kind of rolling, impenetrable fortress you only see in motorcades for heads of state in active war zones. The tinted windows were pitch black, absorbing the dim streetlights like a void. A man stepped out of the driver's side. He wore a sharply tailored black suit that bulged slightly at the left underarm, an obvious, unmistakable tell for a concealed shoulder holster. He walked up my crumbling concrete steps with the absolute, mechanical purpose of a predator. A moment later, 3 sharp, rhythmic knocks hammered against my wooden door, shaking the frame. I opened it just enough to keep the heavy brass deadbolt chain engaged. The man did not speak a single word. He simply reached into his perfectly pressed jacket and slid a thick, cream-colored envelope through the narrow gap. The paper was incredibly heavy, wildly expensive, and sealed with crimson wax bearing an intricate, deeply embossed crest. It was a golden eagle gripping a downward-pointing sword, the Sterling family seal. I broke the cold wax and pulled out a single, rigid card. The elegant handwritten script offered absolutely no pleasantries, only a set of geographic coordinates, a specific time, and a chillingly polite promise that my recent charitable act required an immediate, highly private conversation. The suited man retreated down the stairs and gestured toward the idling vehicle. It was abundantly clear this was not a request I could decline. The drive lasted exactly 1 hour and 45 minutes, winding deep into the treacherous, snow-covered, jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains. The familiar city lights of Denver quickly faded into total, suffocating darkness, replaced only by the sweeping, blinding beams of the headlights cutting through the dense, ancient pine forests. We passed through 2 separate, heavily armed checkpoint gates, where guards with assault rifles scrutinized our plates, before the tree line finally broke. Emerging from the shadows was an isolated, sprawling mansion constructed of dark stone and thick, bulletproof glass. It sat perched precariously on a cliffside like a modern eagle's nest, radiating immense, untouchable wealth and terrifying, silent power. I was escorted through echoing marble hallways, completely devoid of any human warmth or life, and brought into a massive, cavernous wood-paneled study. The heavy air inside smelled of aged leather binding, incredibly expensive bourbon, and old, generational money. Standing rigid by a roaring stone fireplace was General Arthur Sterling. He was a living military legend, a man whose chest was once covered in stars and medals, who had now retreated to the shadows to command a vast empire as the head of a multi-billion-dollar defense investment fund. Even in civilian clothes, his posture was rigidly straight, his jaw locked tight with the unwavering authority of a man entirely accustomed to sending thousands of young men to war with a single command. He did not offer me a drink. He did not offer me a seat. He simply turned, his boots clicking sharply against the hardwood, walked to his massive mahogany desk, and picked up a glossy photograph. He slid it across the polished wood toward me. I stepped forward and looked down. It was a formal, studio-lit portrait of a vibrant, smiling young woman draped in designer silk, standing gracefully at some lavish corporate charity gala. The hair was impeccably styled, the face glowing with flawless health and absolute privilege, but the underlying bone structure, the sharp, intelligent, deeply expressive eyes, they were completely unmistakable. It was the desperate, freezing mother from the storm. "Her name is Chloe," General Sterling said. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that commanded the cavernous room and rattled the glass on his desk. "She is my only biological daughter, and currently, she is the primary target of a classified, off-the-books federal manhunt." I kept my facial expressions perfectly neutral, utilizing years of corporate poker faces to mask the sudden, violent spike in my heart rate. "Why exactly is your daughter a fugitive, General?" His square jaw tightened, a brief flash of pure agonizing humiliation crossing his deeply weathered features. "Because exactly 2 years ago, she embezzled $4 million from my family's private Veterans Relief Fund. She wired the money through an incredibly complex labyrinth of offshore shell corporations, meticulously wiped the internal server logs, and vanished into thin air. She left me with a catastrophic public scandal that nearly destroyed my entire decorated career and my family legacy." I looked away from the glamorous photograph and stared directly into the hardened, bitter face of the old soldier, my analytical brain, strictly trained to dissect complex financial fraud and unmask human deception, instantly locked onto a glaring, mathematically impossible contradiction. The astronomical numbers he just threw at me simply did not align with the brutal, freezing reality I had witnessed firsthand. "With all due respect, General," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy, oppressive silence of the room like a cold steel scalpel, "you are being lied to." His gray eyes narrowed dangerously, a silent threat radiating from his massive frame. "Excuse me. I track missing corporate money for a living. I continued, stepping a few inches closer to the desk, completely ignoring the deeply intimidating aura he projected. I profile the specific types of people who steal it. A mastermind thief who successfully executes a flawless $4 million cyber heist does not live in a rusted, unregistered, broken-down sedan. They do not wear paper-thin, ragged thrift store coats in the middle of a massive blizzard. And most importantly, General, they absolutely do not risk going to a federal prison over $150 worth of generic baby formula and cheap fever medicine because they are completely hopelessly broke. I let the heavy weight of my logical deduction hang in the silent air, watching closely as the absolute, rigid certainty in his eyes began to violently fracture. Your daughter is not a criminal mastermind living in luxury on some tropical island, I stated firmly, offering no comfort, only the brutal facts. She is starving to death, she is utterly terrified, and she is running for her very life from someone much, much worse than the federal authorities. The legendary old general physically staggered backward, gripping the thick edge of the mahogany desk so hard his knuckles turned white, acting as if all the oxygen had just been abruptly sucked out of the room. The hardened, untouchable military commander vanished before my eyes, replaced in a split second by a shattered, aging father finally realizing the horrifying, devastating depth of his own blindness. His breathing turned rapid and ragged. He looked down at the smiling photograph of his little girl, his large hands trembling violently against the wood. My own private security forces are actively hunting her down right now, he whispered, the absolute, paralyzing dread completely evident in his changing tone. If they find her first, they are ordered to treat her as a highly hostile threat. He looked up, his wet eyes locking onto mine with a desperate, pleading intensity. You found her once. You saw the truth that my highly trained intelligence operatives completely missed. Find my little girl, Miss Garza. I am begging you to find her before the dangerous people working for me do. Finding Chloe was not a matter of standard police work. It was a matter of interpreting digital breadcrumbs. I drove straight back to my apartment, locked the heavy deadbolt, and fired up my encrypted terminal. I bypassed the standard Vortex Data Solutions protocols and dove directly into the dark, unregulated networks of gray market data brokers. I accessed municipal traffic cameras, automated toll booth sensors, and private parking lot license plate readers. The rusted sedan from the Walmart parking lot had no registration, but a vehicle with a shattered left taillight and a distinct dent on the rear bumper leaves an undeniable digital footprint on high-resolution security lenses. It took me exactly 4 hours and 12 minutes to trace the chaotic trajectory of her desperate escape. The trail led to a dilapidated, cash-only motel on the absolute bleeding edge of the suburban sprawl. It was a concrete nightmare favored by junkies, fugitives, and people who had completely fallen off the map. When I kicked open the rotted wooden door of room number 11, the smell of damp mildew and absolute despair hit me like a physical blow. Chloe was huddled in the darkest corner of a stained, sagging mattress. She was clutching a cheap, dull kitchen knife, her eyes wide with the absolute, feral terror of a hunted animal. Little Leo was sleeping fitfully beside her, his breathing heavy, his fever slightly broken but still dangerously high. I did not give her a single second to panic or run. I spoke with total, clinical authority, assuring her that the private security forces hunting her were no longer a threat because I was taking her directly to the only man who could call them off. I packed her meager belongings into a single plastic trash bag, wrapped the sick child in a heavy wool blanket, and drove them straight up the mountain to the Sterling estate. The reunion inside the cavernous, wood-paneled study of the mansion was not a cinematic, tearful embrace. It was a violent, suffocating collision of immense guilt and unhealed trauma. When General Sterling finally saw his daughter, skeletal, bruised by life, and shivering in a coat that smelled of cheap motel soap, his legs completely gave out beneath him. The legendary military commander, a man who had stared down enemy fire without blinking, collapsed to his knees right there on the imported Persian rug. He did not speak a single word. He just let out a guttural, agonizing sob that echoed off the mahogany walls, the sound of a father realizing he had utterly failed his only child. Chloe stood frozen by the doorway. Her defensive posture was rigidly locked, gripping her son tightly against her chest like a human shield. The physical space between them was filled with 2 solid years of toxic silence, agonizing misunderstandings, and deep, festering wounds. I stepped right between them, acting as the neutral, analytical mediator. I poured a heavy glass of expensive bourbon, shoved it firmly into the general's trembling hand, and gently guided Chloe to a leather armchair near the roaring fire. Once the initial shockwave of the reunion finally passed, the real, grueling work began. It was time to dissect the rotting corpse of the lies that had destroyed this family. "Tell him, Chloe," I commanded gently, sitting across from her with a yellow legal pad and a pen. "Tell him exactly how Julian Cross executed the theft." At the mere mention of that specific name, both Chloe and the general flinched violently. Julian Cross was her ex-husband, on public paper. He was a charismatic, devastatingly handsome private military contractor, a brilliant rising star in the highly lucrative defense sector. But as Chloe began to speak, her voice trembling but slowly gaining desperate strength, the horrifying, pitch-black reality of her marriage bled into the opulent room. Julian was not just a successful businessman, he was a masterclass in psychological warfare and domestic terrorism. He had systematically isolated her from her friends and her father, eroding her sanity with calculated, daily emotional abuse. He monitored her phone calls, strictly controlled her finances, and constantly gaslighted her into believing she was losing her grip on reality. Then, the ultimate financial slaughter began. Julian had covertly cloned her administrative security credentials for the Family Veterans Relief Fund. Over a grueling period of 6 months, he meticulously siphoned the $4 million through a blindingly complex, untraceable web of dummy corporations located in obscure offshore tax havens. He used her designated Internet Protocol addresses, her specific digital keystroke patterns, and her personal authorization signatures. He built a flawless, mathematically perfect paper trail that pointed the finger of guilt directly at the mother of his newborn child. "If his framing was so perfectly executed, why did you run?" the general rasped, his voice raw with disbelief and mounting fury. "Why not stay and fight him in a federal court with my army of corporate lawyers? We could have utterly destroyed him." Chloe looked up at her father, heavy tears finally spilling over her hollow, exhausted cheeks. "Because of what he threatened to do to you, Dad." Julian had not just stolen the money to get rich. He had fabricated a devastatingly authentic, highly classified dossier of military communications. He perfectly forged the general's signature on highly treasonous documents detailing illegal, off-the-books weapons sales to blacklisted foreign terrorist regimes. He cornered Chloe in their pristine nursery one night, holding a screaming, newborn Leo over the crib, and delivered his final, terrifying ultimatum. If she went to the police, or if she even tried to defend herself against the massive embezzlement charges, he would instantly leak the fabricated dossier to the international press. He promised her that her legendary decorated father would die in a maximum security federal penitentiary for high treason. Furthermore, he promised he would use his immense wealth to ensure she was legally deemed an unfit, criminally insane mother, locking her in a psychiatric ward for life while he took full, uncontested custody of their infant son. She had exactly 1 hour to make her final choice. So, to protect the legendary reputation of the father she loved and the physical safety of her innocent son, she actively chose to become the villain. She ran into the night, carrying the crushing, unbearable weight of a $4 million lie, actively condemning herself to a miserable life of starvation, freezing streets, and constant, paralyzing terror. The resulting silence in the study was absolute. It was thick with a murderous, suffocating rage that practically vibrated in the air. The general was staring deeply into the roaring fire. His square jaw locked so tightly, I thought his teeth might literally shatter under the pressure. I opened my encrypted laptop, completely ignoring the heavy emotional atmosphere of the room, and ran a deep, comprehensive background search on Julian Cross and his current public status. The results that rapidly populated my glowing screen made my stomach physically churn with disgust. While Chloe was agonizingly rationing out generic baby formula in a freezing parking lot to keep his biological son alive, Julian was living in absolute, unadulterated luxury. The digital screen displayed dozens of recent magazine articles praising him as an outstanding, highly moral philanthropic leader in the community. He was photographed wearing exquisitely tailored Italian suits, smiling brilliantly at high society charity galas, and raising expensive champagne glasses in toasts to his own fabricated, hollow integrity. But the final, most sickening piece of intelligence I uncovered was the absolute climax of his parasitic, relentless ambition. Julian Cross was currently engaged to be married. The bride was the only daughter of a highly influential, sitting United States Senator who specifically chaired the Armed Services Committee. The upcoming wedding was merely a strategic stepping stone, a coldly calculated political alliance perfectly designed to guarantee Julian's private military firm an upcoming, highly classified defense contract worth exactly $1 billion. He had systematically destroyed a family, stolen millions of dollars, tortured his own wife, and callously used the shattered bones of his victims to build an untouchable, gleaming empire of lies. The glass in the general's hand suddenly shattered. The expensive bourbon splashed across the Persian rug, mingling with the heavy, violent silence in the study. General Sterling did not even flinch at the blood dripping from his palm. He simply turned, his eyes burning with a terrifying, cold fury, and reached for the encrypted red telephone sitting on his heavy desk. He was going to mobilize his private security contractors. He was going to authorize a black operations strike team to drag Julian Cross out of his penthouse and make him disappear forever. "Put the phone down, General," I said. My voice was a sharp crack of a whip in the quiet room. "Do not do it." He stopped, his hand hovering over the receiver. "That man destroyed my family. He tortured my daughter. I am going to erase him from the face of the earth." "And he will completely destroy you from the grave," I countered, stepping directly into his line of sight. "Think about the board. General, look at the pieces. Julian is currently hiding behind a sitting United States Senator. He has the absolute political protection of the Armed Services Committee. If you send armed men to his house, Julian becomes the wealthy, innocent victim of a deranged, disgraced military commander. He will use his political leverage to bury you in federal prison, and Chloe will spend the rest of her life running. You cannot beat him with bullets. You have to beat him with his own weapon." The old soldier slowly lowered his hand, the rage still boiling just beneath his skin. "What exactly are you suggesting, Miss Garza?" "I am suggesting we execute a digital assassination," I replied, the adrenaline finally taking over my exhaustion. "We do not just kill him, we dismantle him. We completely obliterate his reputation, his finances, and his freedom at the exact moment he feels completely untouchable. We strike this weekend, right in the middle of his lavish engagement party." 48 hours later, I was back inside the sterile, freezing confines of the Vortex Data Solutions corporate headquarters. It was the dead of night. The massive open-plan office was entirely empty, illuminated only by the harsh blue glow of my triple monitors. I cracked my knuckles, took a massive sip of black coffee, and went to war. Julian Cross was arrogant, but he was not stupid. His personal financial network was shielded behind military-grade encryption and 7 layers of dynamic firewalls. But firewall architecture is just math, and math always has a backdoor if you know exactly where to look. Chloe had provided me with the specific administrative keystroke patterns he favored. I routed my connection through a dozen international proxy servers, masking my digital footprint, and aggressively hammered the weak points in his firm's payroll routing system. It took me exactly 5 hours and 40 minutes of relentless coding to crack the outer shell. Once inside, I bypassed the security tripwires and dove deep into the hidden ledgers of his offshore accounts. I was looking for the stolen $4 million, But what I actually found was something infinitely more dangerous. It was the holy grail of corporate fraud. The original $4 million was not just sitting in a static account gathering interest. Julian was actively using it as a massive, rotating liquidity pool. He was taking huge deposits of dirty, untraceable cash from a highly notorious, extremely violent drug cartel operating on the southern border. He was washing their blood money through his legitimate military contracting shell companies, taking a 20% cut for his services, and returning the clean funds to the cartel bosses. Julian Cross was not just an embezzler. He was the primary money launderer for one of the most ruthless criminal organizations on the entire continent. I printed the routing numbers, the illicit wire transfers, and the encrypted communication logs, shoved them into a secure briefcase, and drove straight back up the mountain. We turned the general's mahogany study into a high-tech war room. Chloe sat beside me at the command table, her fear finally replaced by a cold, focused determination. We were no longer playing defense. We were actively hunting. "This is the payload," I explained, projecting the cartel ledgers onto a large monitor. "Julian is hosting his engagement gala at a five-star hotel downtown this Saturday night. He is going to stand up in front of 200 of the most powerful politicians, investors, and media figures in the state. He is going to give a speech about his honor and his pristine integrity." I typed a rapid sequence of commands into my terminal, generating a highly malicious, self-replicating digital worm. "At that exact moment," I continued, "I will be inside the ballroom. I will bridge the gap between my localized terminal and the hotel's audiovisual network. We are going to hijack the massive projection screens right behind him. We are going to broadcast every single illegal transaction, every forged document, and every cartel wire transfer directly to his wealthy guests. But the real trap is the failsafe." I looked at the general. He was smiling. It was the terrifying, predatory smile of a legendary tactician who knew he had already won the war. "Julian is a survivor," I said, finalizing the execution code. "When the screens change, he will instantly panic. His first instinct will be to use his mobile device to trigger a complete server wipe and transfer all his liquid assets to a burner account so he can flee the country. We are going to let him press that button. We are going to let him think he escaped. But we are going to rewire the destination." We had exactly 3 days to test the trap. Every line of code had to be flawless. Every contingency had to be covered. We were building a perfect, inescapable digital cage, and Julian Cross was about to confidently lock himself inside. The Grand Zenith Hotel in downtown Denver was a blinding monument to excessive wealth. The five-star Grand Ballroom was draped in cascades of white orchids and imported French silk. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the state's most powerful elite. I stood near the back of the massive hall, holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne that I had absolutely no intention of drinking. I wore a tailored navy blue evening gown, blending perfectly into the crowd of 200 guests under the fabricated cover of a senior investment fund director. The air inside the room was heavy with the suffocating smell of designer perfume, roasted truffles, and the intoxicating arrogance of people who believed they were entirely untouchable. They had absolutely no idea they were currently standing inside a meticulously constructed kill zone. I checked the heavy gold watch on my left wrist. It was exactly 8:30 in the evening. The meticulous clockwork of our operation was ticking down to 0. I casually shifted my gaze toward the 4 heavy mahogany double doors, acting as the primary exits for the ballroom. Standing quietly near each set of doors were men dressed in immaculate black tuxedos. They did not carry themselves like standard hotel event staff. They possessed the rigid, hyper-vigilant posture and the cold, sweeping eyes of seasoned combat veterans. General Sterling had called in heavy favors from his darkest days in the service. He had quietly deployed his most loyal ghosts. Every single exit was entirely sealed. No one was getting out until the slaughter was complete. I reached into my small silk clutch purse and wrapped my fingers around the custom-built remote transmitter. The tiny green light on the device pulsed steadily. confirming that the digital bridge I had secretly established with the audiovisual network of the hotel was holding strong. I took a slow, deep breath, visualizing the terrified face of Chloe shivering in that motel room. The time for hiding was officially over. The ambient music suddenly faded, and the main overhead lights dimmed to a soft, dramatic glow. A brilliant white spotlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the grand stage at the front of the hall. Julian Cross stepped up to the silver microphone. He looked like a sovereign king holding court. He wore a bespoke tuxedo that undoubtedly cost more than a luxury vehicle. His hair was perfectly styled, his jawline sharp, his entire demeanor radiating absolute control. Standing right beside him, gripping his arm with adoring eyes, was his beautiful fiancée, the daughter of the senator. Julian offered the crowd a brilliant, devastating smile. It was the exact same charming, magnetic smile he had used to systematically tear his ex-wife's sanity into bloody pieces. The massive crowd went completely dead silent, totally captivated by the charismatic monster standing before them. He raised his glass, the crystal catching the bright spotlight. "Ladies and gentlemen," his smooth, confident voice echoed powerfully through the massive surround sound speakers. "Tonight is not simply a celebration of love, it is a celebration of a profound union built on shared, unbreakable values. We are looking toward a bright future, a future that must be firmly grounded in absolute integrity, unwavering loyalty, and the highest possible standard of honor." The sheer audacity of the word honor leaving his lips made my stomach physically twist with disgust. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I pressed the trigger button hidden inside my purse. I crushed it with every ounce of suppressed rage I had been carrying since that freezing night at the supermarket. The massive, high-definition digital screens covering the entire wall behind the stage were scheduled to play a heavily produced, romantic video montage of the happy couple. Instead, the bright screens suddenly went pitch black. The sudden darkness lasted for exactly 2 seconds. Then, the digital payload detonated. The gigantic screens exploded with blinding white light and raw financial data. It was an absolutely beautiful, terrifying sight. High resolution, towering images of the offshore shell company routing numbers filled the entire wall. Highlighted in bright crimson were the massive, illegal wire transfers totaling exactly $4 million, explicitly tracing the money directly from the Sterling Family Veterans Relief Fund straight into Julian's private accounts. The crowd gasped in unison, a wave of confusion washing over the room. Julian froze, the glass of champagne halting halfway to his mouth. He turned his head slowly toward the screens, the color draining instantly from his perfectly tanned face. But the visual data was only the appetizer. The real poison was in the audio. The romantic background track was brutally cut off. In its place, a harsh, crackling audio recording hijacked the main speaker system, blasting at maximum volume. It was Julian's own distinct voice, secretly recorded during a drunken, careless phone call to one of his cartel money laundering associates just 3 weeks prior. "The old man is a complete, utter moron," the recorded voice of Julian sneered, the words echoing violently over the heads of the shocked elite. "The senator will sign whatever billion-dollar defense contract I put on his desk as long as I marry his pathetic, desperate daughter. He is nothing but a useful idiot, and she is just the key to the vault. Once the ink is dry, I will own them both." The entire grand ballroom erupted into absolute, deafening chaos. It was a glorious, uncontrolled implosion of high society. The senator, who had been proudly standing in the front row, turned a shade of violent, murderous red. He stormed directly up the stairs and onto the stage. He grabbed Julian violently by the lapels of his expensive bespoke jacket and delivered a brutal, open-handed slap across his cheek. The sharp crack of the strike echoed like a gunshot through the room. "The wedding is completely canceled," the senator roared, his voice shaking with pure, unadulterated fury as he shoved Julian violently backward. The beautiful fiancée was standing, frozen in horror. covering her mouth and sobbing uncontrollably as the illusion of her life shattered into dust. At that exact, calculated moment, the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the hall violently burst open. The Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Police, fully armed and operating on the massive, undeniable dossier General Sterling had anonymously delivered to their director that very morning, swarmed into the room. Dozens of agents in tactical gear pushed through the screaming, panicking crowd, shouting orders and forming a tight perimeter around the stage. Julian stumbled backward, a bright red mark glowing furiously on his cheek. His pristine world was collapsing violently around him in real time, but as the federal agents aggressively rushed the stage, I watched his eyes dart frantically across the chaotic room. He was a cornered predator, but he was not dead yet. His sharp gaze cut through the panicked crowd and locked directly onto me standing calmly at the back of the hall. He did not know my name, but he instantly recognized the cold, calculating posture of the architect who had just destroyed him. He slowly straightened his expensive silk tie. With a terrifyingly calm motion, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek, heavily encrypted mobile phone. He was going for the kill switch. He stared directly into my eyes, fully aware that I was watching his every move. His thumb hovered deliberately over the glowing screen. He was preparing to activate his emergency protocol, a command designed to instantly wipe every single corrupt server he owned, scatter the cartel money to the wind, and purchase a clean, untraceable route out of the country, standing amidst the ruins of his empire. Julian Cross looked right at me and offered a chilling, arrogant smile. He thought he still had a way out. He thought he was going to win. Julian pressed his thumb aggressively against the glowing screen of his device. He waited for the digital confirmation. The green light that meant his vast wealth was secure and his private jet was waiting on the runway. Instead, the screen flashed a brilliant, unforgiving red. Access denied. Routing error. His arrogant smile completely vanished, replaced instantly by a mask of raw, unfiltered panic. He tapped the glass again, much harder this time. Nothing happened. The money was not moving. I walked slowly down the center aisle, moving seamlessly through the shocked crowd and the advancing federal authorities. I stepped right up to the edge of the stage, stopping just inches away from where Julian stood. He stared down at me, his breathing shallow and rapid. "What did you do?" he hissed, his voice trembling with fear. "I anticipated your escape route," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, almost polite. 24 hours ago, I bypassed your secondary security failsafe. You did not just try to move your money, Julian. You just authorized a direct, non-refundable wire transfer. All $4 million of that highly illegal cartel cash did not go to your secret offshore account. I rerouted the destination. Julian's eyes widened in sheer terror. "Where?" he demanded. "Straight into the senator's official campaign finance fund," I smiled coldly. "Under your personal name." I watched the exact second his brain processed the catastrophic reality of his situation. The federal agents rushing the stage now had concrete, undeniable digital proof that he had just attempted to bribe a sitting United States official with millions of dollars in dirty cash. But that was only his legal problem. The much bigger problem was the drug cartel. As far as the ruthless crime syndicate operating on the southern border was concerned, Julian Cross had just stolen $4 million of their blood money and given it to a politician. He was no longer just facing a lifetime in a federal penitentiary. He was a dead man walking, destined to be hunted by the criminal underworld for the rest of his extremely short life. The absolute gravity of his destruction crushed him. The arrogant, untouchable military contractor physically collapsed. He fell hard onto his knees right there on the grand stage, his expensive mobile phone slipping from his trembling fingers and shattering on the hardwood floor. He did not fight back. He did not speak another word. The federal agents grabbed his arms, slammed him roughly against the floor, and locked heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. They dragged him away, a broken, terrified shell of a man. parading him right through the absolute disgust and contempt of the very elite society he had fought so ruthlessly to conquer. 1 month later, the suffocating winter storm had finally broken, making way for a brilliant, clear Colorado spring. I drove my modest car back up the winding mountain road to the Sterling estate. The oppressive, cold atmosphere that had once choked the massive stone mansion was completely gone. As I walked onto the expansive back patio, I heard a sound that had been entirely absent the first time I visited. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated laughter. Out on the manicured green lawn, bathed in warm sunlight, the legendary military commander was down on his hands and knees. General Arthur Sterling was not commanding troops or brokering billion-dollar defense contracts. He was happily chasing a giggling, energetic 2-year-old boy across the grass. Chloe sat in a comfortable patio chair nearby, sipping a glass of iced tea. She looked radiant, healthy, and completely at peace. The federal authorities had reviewed the irrefutable evidence I provided, clearing her name entirely and expunging any trace of the fabricated charges from her record. Her honor was fully restored. She was finally free. The general had tried to offer me a massive, life-changing financial reward for my services, a blank check, he had called it. I politely, but firmly, declined. I did not want his money. I only accepted a simple, quiet family dinner cooked in their kitchen. Later that evening, as I drove back down the mountain toward my normal, quiet life, I thought about that freezing night at the suburban supermarket. I thought about the sheer, ridiculous power of a tiny act of kindness in a ruthless world. I had only swiped my corporate card for $150. It was a remarkably small investment, but it had successfully bought back an entire family, and it had completely burned a demon to the ground. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Maya Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.